Hello, everybody, and welcome to week 11, 2026. This is Mind Print Hash with myself, Cameron Otsuka, and my co host, Matt Dines. A really, really fun episode today. I think Matt has, really explained to me beforehand during our pre show briefing kind of exactly where he's taking this. But just to tee things off, first off, the thumbnail image that you all see of Trump with the axe. It's Iran kind of splitting the log in half two different ways between Europe and China and Asia. Really, I think it is indicative of what's going on in terms of trade. And so, again, trade here is really the thing that matters. We have in Matt's framework of what's going on today, we're seeing a realignment in terms of these consumption markets that are so important to every large economic player in the world throughout history. And so, as we're going through this realignment, I think Matt's going to make some parallels to the past. We're going to start with a short history lesson to kind of bring everybody up to speed in terms of what he means when he says these consumption markets are realigning. And then moving through to today to understand better what's going on in terms of this Iran fog of war that we're all trying to sort through. There's media headlines, there's different social media influencers online telling you different things about why we're doing XYZ thing, but I don't think they really get to the meat and potatoes of what is actually going on. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt here, and I'm going to flip us to the first slide of our deck here, which is really uh, showing the plus ultra and the non plus ultra. So Matt, can you explain for our audience here what this photo means or is depicting, and then what those words, those phrases mean?
Yep. So in the background here, this nice scenic image, this is the Strait of Gibraltar. Towards kind of the foreground of the photo, you've got the European side with the Rock of Gibraltar, famous landmark, and on the other side, you've got the north coast of Africa. These two, rock features make up, what's been known for millennia at this point in human civilization as the Pillars of Hercules. Um, just remember, hey, they separated them by Greek myth, Hercules literally pushed these puppies apart and gave us this pass, which basically connects the Mediterranean Sea, where from the Western perspective or the European perspective, or that fork of human history, a lot of the development has taken place, over the last couple. Um, but you basically got towards the right, that's the Mediterranean Sea. It goes in towards Europe, Middle East, etc. That key bastion of trade. And I've got the Roman Colosseum up there as an image here. Their quote here was non plus ultra, or their motto, nothing beyond here. So this was kind of like the end of the world if you were born, at the time of the Roman Empire, maybe before that. But it was exactly that, nothing beyond here. And on the other side of that, once you get into what becomes the Atlantic Ocean, plus ultra, that was the moniker of the Spanish Empire. Once, or like really reflected in kind of the European explorers who, start with Christopher Columbus, really, coming out of Genoa, but financed by I want to say the kings, queens, the royalty on the Iberian Peninsula in Portugal and Spain. Spanish Empire basically lived by that moniker, go beyond, right? So it was really taking trade from the old world and the framework that built up around Europe. You trace the lineage here, starts in Rome. You do all the forking. You've got colonies in Judea, which is modern day Israel. The setting for the Middle East situation, everything we're hearing about with the big events in the last 2 weeks in Iran, but also moving up through Constantinople or Istanbul with the Byzantine Empire, forking off. We talked about the Silk Roads, then moving into Venice, and then up and beyond. The financial empire from that route traces its way back up through the Netherlands into England and the UK into the modern day. On the opposite side of that, the plus ultra, the Spanish, that's where you really see this trade emerging with the new world and the old. And basically, what I'm saying here, we've got two worlds who are colliding here. And if we try to take this big picture framework, we can start to peel back and make a little bit more sense of what the heck is going on here with this U.S. and Iran situation. Um, One of the things I look at, Cameron, if we're going to go to the New York Times slide, one of the key tells here in understanding what's going on, um, I'm looking to is listening to what the other regional power brokers who are not involved directly in the US and Iran situation, what are they saying about it? And if you read between the lines, that'll give you some clues into the overall context here. I think the biggest and most important piece of evidence that I saw in the last week was actually this interview that's been cited in the New York Times. I think the date was March 6th is when it was released, but roughly March 5th or a week ago, last Thursday. Um, at that point, the Iran actions had already been ongoing since Saturday, so we were 5 or 6 days in by the time Vladimir Putin made these statements. But I think the key thing, if you're Vladimir Putin here, that's telling about what is actually going on under the hood is in this quote, and I'm going to read it verbatim. Now other markets are opening up, and perhaps it's more advantageous for us to stop supplying the European market right now, um, is literally what he said. So if you kind of like triangulate everything going on, Russia, United States, Europe, and China as the key regional powers, and how they interact with each other, and split the spoils of resources, interact with each other through monetary systems, financial architecture, all of that. If you look under the hood, we're starting to get at what the important thing is that's actually being fought over
Right.
here. So now if you go to the next slide, Cameron, this is March 11th. This is fresh. This is
Hmm.
yesterday. We get a quote from EU Commissioner Ursula von der Leyen. She, spells out all the blanket, just kind of talking points we're used to hear EU leadership harp on as this situation is now, kind of a decade in terms of maturing. But the key thing here in this tweet where she's laying out her views that I saw was the bit of about her stressing on the importance of the oil price cap and stabilizing energy markets.
Right.
All right, so we're starting to narrow in here. All right,
Yep.
setting the price ceiling is important to the EU. All right, now we're starting to get somewhere. And if you've kind of followed along, we won't go into a deep dive on a news story with this, but over the last few days, as Brent crude, WTI, all of the oil pricing sources, you've seen a run up. Oil's up basically $30 to $40, and like since this crisis started, and that in effect is causing stress on um, some of the markets where consumption or major importers on net of energy commodities are basically a requirement to underpin the economy. So we'll get into the breakdown, which economies is this important to. But you're starting to see here Ursula von der Leyen is just saying the quiet part out loud. High oil prices are something that Europe is going to have trouble dealing with.
Right.
Um, Last off, you see, last thing I'll mention, this is from the European Parliament Twitter account. This is really just coming from a social media intern. It's probably not an important figure like Ursula von der Leyen, who's probably not even drafting her own tweets. Um,
No.
but European Parliament came out same day yesterday, and their talking points or their axis to grind that they wanted to push publicly we're basically calling for a stronger EU Canada partnership amidst this turmoil coming out of the Iran situation, right? What are the things they wanted? Security and defense, right? So you
So
see
see a
you're
lot
starting
of
to see
overlap
here.
here.
Defense over kind of the northern stretch of the northern hemisphere, Canada and Greenland. EU is calling for integration there on a better defensive or a more closely aligned defensive posture. But then also, if you dive deep into this, it's also pushing for free trade, the CETA, Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement between the EU and Canada, which is largely based on no tariffs for energy commodities, right? So what's this about? It's about Europe's access to energy resource commodities. They're telling you the quiet part aloud, or out loud. Who screams the loudest? That's what this fight is largely over, or is largely about. Now, we're going to stress in, this will come back later, so put this in the back of your minds. Key date here, the February 4th to February 6th ish window, right? So that's already 4 to 5 weeks in hindsight. If you want to like put this in your mind, where were we? Feels like forever ago, but it was really
Yeah.
just over a month ago. This was the week before the Japanese snap elections, right? We all know what happened there with Takaichi securing supermajority control of the Japanese Diet for the LDP. But what was going on in the week before that? And we'll get to that on some key macro charts as we close out this episode. But what was everybody doing in that time frame? These four regional powers, and we're going to come to, hey, what's going on with Iran? And this will hopefully shed some light. So, U.S. and China, we had a phone call on February 4th, head to head between President Trump and Xi Jinping, representing the CCP. Thing I want to stress here, Xi reasserted that China's very clear most important issue is Taiwan. So it's top of the list, and then really everything else below the fold. It's the Taiwan situation. Hold that in the back of your mind. What we have coming up here, I want to say March 31st, I believe, roughly through April 2nd. This is less than 3 weeks away. We have Trump's onside official visit to Beijing to meet head to head, U.S. and China. This comes on the back of other significant and critical head-to-head meetings. Most notably, I think, if you'll recall, the Alaska summit between the U.S. and Russia
Right.
back in August, I believe. We've
Yep.
also had some other important ones. Trump's on-site to the U.K., also very similar to that timing. But if you think about these things going on, I'm getting the sense that if you read between the lines here, US, Russia, China, there has been some hashing out of all these details here of major geopolitical importance. China's telling you what it really cares about here. It's Taiwan. US, obviously, what does it care about? Um, Western Hemisphere, kind of Donroe Doctrine type of policy. And um, really securing the non-interference of foreign influence that would prevent, or as this administration sees, would be preventative to the Western Hemisphere and its related economies, further economic growth. That is the key point, I believe, that the U.S. cares about, and obviously there's metals resources, as we all know, that are very aligned with that. And in terms like just broader commodities, once you go outside of the hards, you get into energy commodities, oil and gas. Those are also kind of wrapped up in that topic of discussion. But you're really seeing some degree of clarity here, shaping out on what some sort of understanding would look like between the U.S. and China, in my opinion. Not for the long term, establishing a peace or a global order that can last for multiple decades, if not a century, that type of thing. But for the short term,
How do they kind of
it looks
play
like,
with play nicely with each other, at least in the short term? So you're
yeah,
saying, yep.
we're consolidating down to having some sort of memorandum of understanding or meeting of the minds in terms of shaping up what each would look like and how each of these spheres would interact with each other. All right, so that's U.S. China. Notice, as far as I have seen, we have not seen a Chinese representative, she otherwise, weigh in strongly in the media about the U.S. Iran situation, as far as I have
Yeah,
seen. So maybe I'm not correct there,
I think
but
you're right.
it's been broadly quiet, and the silence speaks volumes in this case. Um, all right, second, February 5th, 6th, there was another call on the Ukraine-Russia situation. Vladimir Zelensky from Ukraine comes out in the press a day after that, on February 7th. publicly stating that the U.S. communicated its goal of wrapping up the Ukraine-Russia war by June, right? So you're starting to look like, oh, how do we get to this endpoint? Everybody can shake hands and call it good, right? Well, there's a lot that has to happen between where we sit today in March and June, but to get there, I think you're starting to see um, some sort of order of operations where something like this could even become possible. So, Ukraine, Russia, and then United States here as the intermediate broker, all of them would also have to be on state on the same playing field
Right.
um, in terms of moving together, internally coordinating on all of that to even make this statement as well. And then Iran, we were in a situation there, these back and forth, these meetings. We saw the Geneva talks fall apart 2 weeks ago, which led directly into the action that began on Saturday, February 28th, that we're all well familiar with at this point. But U.S. and Iran were in back channel diplomacy meetings in Oman at that point as well. Um, and the rumor was February 5th, the same time window, a planned Iran US meeting might be canceled. That started this bottoming in the chart or this upswing in Brent crude at that time. So markets were confirming. We see all of these big powers kind of coming together. Notice who's left out of this framework. I'd say Europe, London, etc. They're kind of the odd man out at the table,
Right.
which is kind of, hey, maybe that's got a lot to do with this. All right. And then last, this one's not hyper important, but Vice President J.D. Vance also publicly floated during this key window in February 4th to 6th that I'll talk about, or that we're talking about. This idea of a critical minerals trade block, which you'd presume would be the United States allies or this Western Hemisphere coalition. So we're narrowing in here on the importance. All right, now we're going to get to Gulf, Persian Gulf exports. What's important? Why is this action even taking place in Iran? I'm going to roll back the clock 4 decades. This is a Congressional Research Service report for Washington D.C. insiders in 1987. This puppy spans my entire life, basically. Um, this is the state of play as far as we've talked about the shipping vessels in the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz. That is the key talking point you hear on everybody's mind. It's financial markets, every headline. Persian Gulf trade. When is it going to open up? It's basically zeroed or shut down at this point
Right.
because of the lack of insurance industry capacity. All right. So you look at Gulf exports. Obviously, we know Persian Gulf. What have they been doing? Their economy is largely underpinned by oil exports and natural gas exports. Ramping up after the development of oil production. But this has been basically the entire second half of the 20th century, right? Post World War II, Saudi starts, turning on oil fields, all of that, and they become increasingly critical to global energy markets. Back in 1987, so if you look at market share of Gulf Coast country coalition member exports going to the rest of the world out of the Persian Gulf, Japan was consuming like basically 47, 48%. So Japan had or owned the lion's share. And then over a quarter of that was France. US was basically like 5.5% in terms of market share. But basically, what we see, think about these countries, right? USA, France, Germany, and then Japan. They're the post war kind of partners in the on the Allied side that came out victorious out of World War II. So your Western European democracies, United States, and then Japan came in as basically a proxy state overseen by MacArthur in the U.S. coming out of the post-war order, and basically this market was divvied up amongst those powers. Now you get to the modern day. This is all of that trade, imports and exports counted here. So gross trade, we can kind of get a footprint here of what are the endpoints? We've got supply here, all of those oil producing countries. I got the 6 GCC countries, and then I'll add in Iraq because post Iraq War II, flipping from Saddam to this, I guess, Shia coalition government. It's kind of in a similar order, kind of not, but let's count it as global trade. But this is basically a proxy for all of the seaborne exports from the Persian Gulf that's then traded with the rest of the world. You'll see who owns the market share. So starting from the point, why would the U.S. even get involved in this region? We don't have much market share in this in terms of the actual goods moving, right? You see the blue, this is the source here is the Observatory of Economic Complexity. It's oec.world. Pretty good graphics here on trade. U.S. has no real market share here in terms of our shipping interests from source to destination. We're not actually a big consumer here. We're not reliant on Saudi oil experts in the same way we were post 1970s oil shock up until let's say 2008, where fracking technology reached the point where the U.S. could once again be a net energy producer, which is a modern development in the last 10 to 15 years, but a huge shift. U.S. isn't big here on trade. What we own is the financial side of this, and we'll get to it later. Who owns this market now, right? We talked about France accounting for a quarter of gross trade through the center, and then Japan being roughly half in 1987. This is the European footprint. I don't know if we added up all these pink shares, maybe it's a quarter, maybe.
Yeah.
But what you'll see here, this is a much more important source of goods or source of production of hard commodities for Europe and those members of the Allied post-war coalition than it is for the U.S. itself, right? So there's your split point, in my opinion.
Yep.
And then what's actually happened here, your Asian economies have just grown, and this is, I'm just pointing out the obvious here. Nothing, very insightful about this, but the growth of the Asian economies has basically squeezed out the European economies from this from these supply resources or from this source market, and I think that's largely reflected in what we're seeing. Remember, we talked about the world leader quotes at the beginning.
Right.
Ursula von der Leyen stressing the price cap. In open competition, the Asian market dominates European competitiveness for these resources. And without that price cap, Europe is no longer able to kind of incorporate this the supply source for its own needs.
Right.
Is largely what I see playing out here. All right, so we talk. Why is the U.S. involved here?
Yes.
If it's not a major, it doesn't run the ships. We don't have the shipping industry footprint, so we're not making money there. It doesn't consume the output of these source economies, so that's not important.
Right.
I think the signal you're looking for here, 5 of the 6 countries in the GCC hard peg their currency to the USD. And the one that doesn't, Kuwait, it pegs to a currency basket, which it doesn't release the weights on, but it includes the dollar, the US dollar, also the British pound, the euro, and the Japanese yen. So 5 out of 6, and then some weighting. All of these economies denominate and anchor their own sovereign currencies to the US dollar. So as we think about, I'll go through in terms of hard pegging a foreign currency to another countries. Just focus here on the US dollar. What you're actually doing, it's very similar to coinage in my mind. So when you think about old world, we'll get into that in a second. Might actually be our very next slide.
Yep.
We're going to talk about the Spanish Empire here. One slide ahead. We start with the Spanish Empire, which outcompeted, we've talked about this before, via seaborne exploration, and Portugal was the sister twin of the Spanish Empire. They eventually merged. Um, what it outcompeted was those landborne trade routes that we call the Silk Road today.
Yep.
What it actually did in terms of its money, right? We talked about the importance of the silver trade, the uh, cross continent maps, the trade route, where'd the silver go, where'd the goods from Asia go. Slave trade was involved here. Sad story for human history. But silver was the key money, but to actually put it into a useful form, um, the Spanish Empire started coining the milled dollar. You call them pieces of eight, right? You can chop them up. Eventually became the doubloons, all of that. But what you're doing here is you're actually you're forming a money, a unit of currency, but you're anchoring to an embedded standard of value so that your counterparties in trade can quickly and easily, with low cost of verifiability, um, high trust, et cetera, high portability, all of those features of a money. What you're doing is basically anchoring or pegging a money, in this case, to hard commodity and silver to facilitate trade. I'd argue that same thing. Think about the dollar pegs. Like there's a lot of them today. Pegs to the US dollar. Talk about the dollar in terms of a general concept that pervades what we think about. We anchor to the US dollar. Dollar represents um, in the long term frame, once you go back to this silver coin that we're looking at here, like exactly that, it's a medium without a centralized authority. In this case, going back to the Spanish milled dollar, um, that facilitates trade between counterparties who may or may not trust each other in cross-border, like globalized transactions, is like as broadly as I can kind of
You're talking
framework.
about like
And this
the
is some
network effect of everybody being on the same system, right? If we all agree that we're going to
Yeah.
use this unit of account or this medium of exchange, I don't have to worry about how do I transfer, between these different
Yep.
exchanges and all of that. Yep.
Yep. All right. So I'm talking about very vague, fuzzy things here. I'm trying to nail Jello to the wall, but hopefully we'll start to anchor it in. This is what mind print hash is all about,
Hmm.
right? So I'll I'll put it in. Why? Let's look at this silver coin, and this coin on the left here. This is what I could find. This is the oldest Spanish milled dollar that we have in like real life today that still exists, right? Because what actually happens with coinage, it gets melted down. Like let's say we stamped a Roman coin or one kingdom's coin. Um, it moves, with ships across the ocean to another endpoint. Over time, you'll see the coinage get melted down for its melt value whenever the economic profit to do so um, uh, like facilitates, like encourages that behavior. What do I mean by that? All right, today, think about our dollar coins today. I'll talk about the U.S. situation a little bit. So why do I bring up the Spanish milled dollar? This was actually the anchor of value in the U.S. Constitution. So if you go back, like Control F through the U.S. Constitution, look up gold, look up silver. That's how we anchored money. If you want a good book, Money for the U.S. and the 13 colonies, right? Um, Good book on this history is Pieces of Eight by Edwin Vieira. He's still alive as far as like recent months. He's getting up there in age, but if you can find a podcast, like search for that individual. He is extremely well informed. You're going to learn something every time you talk to him. He's a living national treasure in my opinion. So incorporate all you can from him while he's still out there shedding knowledge. Most listeners, if you like this show, you'll like anything he has to say. But U.S. anchored to this thing on the left, this chunk of silver, right? This minted Spanish Empire coin. They didn't look exactly like this after a couple hundred years, but same way we showed the Spanish Empire plus ultra, go outside, go explore. outside of those pillars of Hercules, go trade. Um, that was basically start with the 1500s. By the late 1700s, late 18th century, Spanish Empire was past its prime. It was on its way down. But these coins, because they were such a reliable measurement of value, which is in this case the intrinsic value of the silver metal that's embedded, um, they were still used as the primary money in trade with, mostly the Caribbean, right? As um, East and West were interacting with each other, New World and Old World, all of that stuff we talk about. Spanish Empire was essentially gone, defunct by then. Yet the money still lived
Hmm.
on. And I think that passage with the Constitution, you see that embedded if you actually go Control F where it talks about money, you see the handoff from what the Spanish Empire was doing with the milled dollar. That's handed off to the US. So what we're actually drilling at here, trying to nail the jello to the wall, that standard of value that's represented in this, it's not a fully open empire, right? You still had Spanish Spanish empires or trading territories would only interact with each other. The Portuguese may or may not interact with it. They had to do a hard line, who owned what, with treaties back in the 1500s. English, privateers, all of that, their trade was explicitly forbidden, right? They didn't interact there. But this was your competing monetary network, I'd argue. Competing with what? We'll get into that in a second. Oh, right here. The pound sterling kind of operating framework. So I won't go deep into this here, but the pound sterling, we're all familiar with it. When you think of sterling, what does it mean? It's a specific alloy of coinage that was really established with this Tealby penny to lay the grounds for the sterling silver standard. And if you think about sterling silver, all the fans will know it's 92.5% silver, 7.5% copper. Hold up the Lombardi Trophy every year at the Super Bowl, anything Tiffany, stuff like that. Sterling silver has a brand unto itself. That's like really, it really predates all of this stuff, even that we talked about with the Spanish milled dollar. This goes back to the 8th century um, with like Charlemagne's Frankish Empire. Is how you get these weird kind of ratios. You have what, 12
12
pence
deniers.
to a
Yeah. Yeah.
shilling, 10 or whatever, 10, I don't know. It's like you get to 240. It's not metric system compliant. But anyway, this legacy kind of British system kind of hopped on the back of like Charlemagne's Frankish Empire and Northern Europe, all of that. Um, and so what you're seeing here is really, in my opinion, two hard forks kind of colliding that are embedded in the streams of, like, we're not even talking like modern history. Like these things have antecedents, 500 to 1,000 years in development. So you talk about those dollar pegs of the GCC.
Hmm.
Uh, they're anchoring to the dollar in the middle. Same thing with like the Hong Kong dollar. Um, we've talked about this before, like the dollar standard. Like you've got Singapore dollar, Aussie dollars, Canadian dollars, New Zealand dollars. Even the like what we think about as the Chinese yuan, it actually yuan, my understanding in Mandarin means round, and it was their effort at establishing a standard coinage. And this is only in the early 1900s, but when China even got around to this, um, where they start coining silver into a kind of a minted standard that everybody can agree on to operate trade through, and the Chinese economy as recently as like 100 years ago, right? So you're on that same round, they're still on that same, they're trying to accomplish the same thing, pack in some value, put a wrapper around it, and then that thing can uh facilitate trade between counterparties from A to B, and A to B can be anywhere in the world. Japanese yen, I think the yen in its own nature, I'll double check on this, but if you really prod your AIs, I want to say yen and yuan come from that same root etymology, like round. And you're starting to build up what are humans with their action actually trying to get at here?
Right.
And I think that's kind of enlightening. Um, what the GCC countries, by pegging to the dollar, they're trying to tap in to this underlying kind of network effect that plus ultra go beyond represented. I don't know if I talked about this on the coin, but those two pillars you see, those are representative of the pillars of Hercules. And then you've also got um, some of the Latin here. I think it's the PIV. That's like, it's actually plus ultra. Some of the other coinage you see it struck. This is like coinage or mint technology that's 700, 800 years old, that good or precise.
Sure.
If you've seen a minted coin today, for example, like we've got much crisper technology, and plus these things also sat at the bottom of the ocean for 700 years, so they're not going to look perfect. But that's what you're going out here, and then you see the R. I think a R was stamped for Rei or something like that, and that meant it's from the Spanish sovereign crown that stands behind the weight, the purity, all of that. But all the symbolism, it's embedded in there. These are kind of vaporous topics we're talking about here that this trade is really representing. But when we start to attach the symbolism, the history, we have something more physical, corporeal to pin to the wall and understand what's actually going on. Um,
So, like, maybe let's bring this now to the present, right? Because I think
yep,
you've talked a lot about history, how we got here, why there's these network effects built in, and so I think that goes directly into the other headline, which was this Shield of America's announcement. Which, first off, the logo by itself is just a fun one to look at. It reminds me of like Captain America or something. But maybe help us explain, for the audience here, how does the Shield Americas then plug in directly to this framework that you've outlined for us?
okay. So we talked about the sovereigntist enlightenment, which is really a pushback um, of each individual nation state. And at this point, yeah, UN recognizes what 200 or something member nations who have a seat at that centralized kind of authority,
Hmm.
policing authority, what have you, governance authority, all of that. In my view, what's happening here with the Shield of Americas, right? There's some antecedents in terms of like defense compacts that tried to get off the ground between, say, US or North American parties that have just been kind of false starts in the last 60, 70 years. What this kind of represents here, the Shield of America, is what, and Trump is setting up a lot of new like clubs, institutions, groups, et cetera. So
Right.
it's tough, I think, for most people to keep track of what's going on. The point of this one, this is an opt-in chartered group, if you will, club of Western Hemisphere nations. The specific goal is really rooting out cartel influence within the individual nation states for those Western Hemisphere members. What do we mean by cartels? We mean entities involved in human trafficking, arms trafficking, drug trafficking, etc. And the more you deep into this, you realize it is cross-border trade, and it has a lot to do with the intelligence community, right? And then we get into the collision here. There's better experts than me to point this out, but in my framework, right, we talked about these two different monetary standards that trace back centuries, right?
Right.
Those are economic networks that are represented. And I think those two things have been kind of interacting with each other. They sometimes they play nice, even within themselves. Sometimes they operate in the same money centers, New York, London, etc., Hong Kong. Sometimes in history they don't want to interact at all. So like 1500s, 1600s, Spanish Empire, British Empire, like it's basically kill each other on sight if you see, a privateer or a trading ship.
Right.
Um, so we're at, in my opinion, what we're witnessing, all of these interactions. Iran is kind of representative of like a battle or a proxy fight between those two things, like for the market share of the supply resources starting in the GCC, load up on tankers, ships, etc., trading with the rest of the world. On the other side of that movement of goods, you have to have a financial transaction. In my opinion, that is where the rubber is meeting the road here. Now you're going to get into we'll get into here a couple of charts on major macro assets as kind of portfolio managers. We're not just looking at the fundamental analysis of an individual credit, stuff like that. I also think as we're in this new environment where when the gloves come off and you're in wartime, technical analysis becomes um, of extreme importance. And in my mindset, what you're looking at when you're looking for chart reading, right? This is just horoscopes for men to some degree. But underneath this, like when you're looking at a chart pattern, kind of think about this as like a process unfolding. Like it kind of reflects nature building on itself. This is human interaction, economic transactions behind um, these things building up. So I personally, while coming out of, a master's in finance program, I'm a CFA charter holder, all of that. The dominant paradigm in terms of academia and kind of mainstream or institutional finance is random walks, normal Gaussian distributions, all of that. I don't necessarily, I obviously don't, we know it, like it doesn't hold up to empirical data on things, on how, financial markets actually work. But to put that home, like I think like a fractal representation of what's going on with these processes that these charts are trying to measure. And my point here, when you look at the technical analysis, I'm going to talk about a lower low here in a second. That is indicative of something important going on behind the scenes. All right. So what do I mean by that? I started, I came to this observation by watching the last, 10 to 12 days since that, since the Israel and U.S. coordinated attacks on Iran commenced on February 28th, right? And I think it's been surprising to most and myself that Bitcoin has held up in terms of, like, we all know it's in a 6-month drawdown here. Um, we're talking about 50% territory, right, from that
Right.
$124,000 ish high back in, it was actually October, right?
Hmm.
Um, so it's in a major and significant retracement since then. But during this attack, notice it held up, right? It didn't sell off where bond markets have come in under pressure, equities flagging, the cues look weak. We all know what's been going on in software, et cetera. And then same thing for silver, right? I mean, gold hasn't broken out on this rally. You start to look into the other uh, uh, industrial or precious metal hybrids, silver, platinum, palladium. You can throw those in there, but mainly silver, right? It's the biggest market, most broadly used. It's super. I mean, it's not just important. It's probably critical, right? With silver paste being the best coolant for semiconductors, chips, et cetera. Um, if as a nation state, you can't win this stage of conflict between the great powers if you don't have silver as resources, right? And that's why I think we see this uh, uh, crazy. I don't know what else you this euphoria going on in silver markets
Sure.
that's really been developing over 2025 and into 2026. But anyway, so those two things. If you look at all the macro charts, Bitcoin and silver are two of the key ones that have been most notable to me since the Iran events entered this kinetic stage on February 28th. And in looking back at the charts, both of those two, remember we talked about the February 4th to 6th or 7th being a key window in terms of the geopolitical events, all the phone calls happening. There was a
Right.
lot of active discussions on the telephone there, coordination between all the major players in the game. Notice silver and Bitcoin both put in lower lows on the chart, the same overnight kind of handoff between February 5th and February 6th. Go look in other major macros. No other chart that I can find of importance shows that same observation. And while I don't want to read too much into this, if you're distilling down, doing signal processing, you can get a quant. Probably the AI can do this at the same point too. Run the Kalman filtering uh, on these time series. What this is telling me to my naked eye, these what do these things have in common? All right, we know silver um, is a major, one of the most important hard commodities. Right up there with oil, which we're seeing obviously. Um, display some fireworks here in the last 1 to 2 weeks as the Strait of Hormuz situation becomes front and center. But silver is right up there in terms of the global trade, right? This stuff has to move from source or supply market to the ultimate uh, consumption demand market, which is mostly going to be cross-border trade. It settles, through the international financial markets architecture. Um, and it's basically plugged in as a global market asset at this point. Um, so on the other side of that, what Bitcoin is telling me by the co-integration here between these two time series, Bitcoin for them to both bottom at the exact same time, like in alignment with each other, what it tells me is Bitcoin is playing in that same game that the global silver trade is playing in, if that makes sense,
Hmm.
right? So you think about what's been going on in Bitcoin since October and the Bitcoin to US dollar spot market pair. It's been liquidity taking, right? People are going up. They're in that liquidity market. They're putting more Bitcoin in, or equivalently taking more dollars out, right? Bitcoin selling is taking place. Dollars are leaving that market. It's the opposite. It's just the mirror image of that is what we've seen in silver, especially since September, October. It's been silver out, dollar liquidity in, by and large, right? So what you're seeing here in these two processes, those two um, shaky ponds, what do they have in connection between each other? It's that dollar measurement, the USD, which we went back before, talked about, the Spanish milled dollar. What are we trying to do here? We're trying to like condense down, put that intrinsic value between the bid and the ask, and allow economic participants to coordinate trade with each other. All of that process, you build it up on top of itself. What it what it has developed into over 600 years since Columbus set sail from Spain is this global commodities trade, is this international finance, this dollar international finance trade. Um, that's kind of been co-opted, I think, by its competition, right? We talked about
The growth of
the
Asia and
sterling
sterling. Yep.
standard, right? Yeah, it's been co-opted since 1971 by this other power, which is like this offshore dollar standard. And if we start to, just see, just through, if you squint at it, you can start to see that old world, or the what do you call it, the Spanish milled dollar empire, the Spanish Empire, all of those antecedents that have developed through to the American economy, the colonies, and what's materializing today with cross-border trade and economic agreement between the Western Hemisphere nations, um, extending the Monroe Doctrine, not just kicking out foreign powers saying hands off, but also, in my mind, what stands out if you wanted to add a Donald Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, the same way that the original was foreign powers out of the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt corollary says, hey, U.S. can get involved with other Western Hemisphere nations if we think they're internally operating out of concordance with that original Monroe Doctrine. We view ourselves as having the right to go in there and root that out. That's kind of what you see embedded in the Shield of Americas, the
Right.
cartel extraction, all of that,
Right.
cartel breaking. Now, Monroe Doctrine, I think you extended another step. It's also not okay if you attempt to interfere and inhibit the growth of this, broader and Western Hemisphere mission or economic development on its own
Hmm.
terms and itself. That's also territory non grata. So I think that's what you're seeing in the charts right now. What you're seeing in silver and Bitcoin, um, not just the last 2 weeks and how they've traded post Iran, but also going back to that February 5th bottom. Doesn't tell you everything, but by itself, that's an important signal and tells you what to watch for. I'd say so. If we're looking on the horizon, we've got the end of this month, the Trump visit to China. We're going to find out if everything we've been seeing in the public statements from the world leaders over the last week that we opened up the episode with, as well as that flurry of phone calls and that February 4th to February 6th window. We're going to start to find out if there was a meeting between the minds as this new world order, economic trade, consensus, all of that starts to take shape. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about what we saw this week, trying to put everything in perspective. As I don't know about you, individual viewer, if you're watching with us, but the signal to noise, I think, from mainstream media, but then a lot of influencers uh, has, I mean, in the last 5 to 10 years, when it comes down to the big headline events, I don't know that we've had
It leaves a lot to be desired.
much lower than we've seen in the last 5 to 10 days.
Yep.
So hopefully this adds some context in terms of what is, in my opinion, looking like is developing behind the scenes, and we're going to find out in the next weeks, months, maybe quarters, if that June 2026 for Russia Ukraine. I know we've always been there's been several times in the last year or two where we said, hey, a peace agreement is right around the corner. It's always, you know, just outside of grasp, but we'll see if something is coming together. But hopefully, this time we spent here today has helped you put your ideas and your thoughts together on what's actually kind of formulating out of the fog, and and hopefully what's coming next,
I have to
or anticipating what's coming next.
I think
Yeah.
that's a good spot to leave it for everybody. Thank you again for watching. See you all next week. As always, please subscribe to our YouTube, Substack, as well as X accounts, LinkedIn. Matt and I do a lot to try to make sure we're responding to comments, things like that. If you have any suggestions, feedback, feel free to message us on those platforms. And as always, see you all next week.